time, and I guess it just wasn't playing. All right, so I'm gonna go through a little bit of my airbrush setup and kind of what I do to airbrush. So a few things that I have. This toxic green sludge. This is a deli cup with an old toothbrush, and this has basically, this is probably a little too strong, but I was stripping models in this. I picked up some Death Shroud from a friend of ours. Shout out to Gary Sacco, who sold me some Death Shroud for like 30 bucks, 3 of them. I already have 11, but he's like, I have 3 more for you if you want. So he sells me 3 of these Death Shroud. I don't think he said they were painted or not, but I found out obviously as soon as after I'd paid for them that they are painted, and I took them home and they were sitting in a vat of Simple Green, which is the kind of cleaner I use. That's to strip models for almost 48 hours, and they like the paint literally didn't look any different. So I was like, dude, what did you paint these with? Like enamel super paint? So what I ended up doing is I dumped out most of the Simple Green and I just added water to some of the stripper. But this is way more than I'd normally use. So it's, and this is gonna be just for cleaning my airbrush, and I'll show you guys how I do that. Second, I need my airbrush. So I have this little guy. This is just like an airbrush stand holder. You don't actually need one of these, but it is helpful. And just to go through some airbrush basics, when I airbrush and when I do airbrushing is really, it's about controlling pressure and it's about controlling paint. And what I mean by that is controlling your air pressure and then the viscosity of your paint. And the relationship of those two things is really gonna determine like the whole airbrush process. So what do I mean by that? Well, thicker paint, higher viscosity, needs more air pressure, and thinner paint, so needs less air pressure. Now, why is that important? You're saying, well, Jim, I always just airbrush at say 30 psi or 15 psi. So why is that important? Well, first of all, because for you doing like base coating, if you're doing heavy base coating, say you're doing vehicles. Actually, let me see. Let me know if you guys. I'm gonna just make sure that my gate is set high enough so you can't hear my compressor. So I'm gonna go quiet for a sec and get my compressor to kick in, and hopefully you guys can't hear it. Did anyone hear that? Okay, perfect. So see, I'm not actually bad at technology. I set it up so that when I'm airbrushing, the gate is high enough that you can't hear my compressor. So I'm gonna go through, okay, so sorry. So with airbrushing, the key here is controlling the air pressure and then the viscosity. So for most base coating, heavy base coating, I'm gonna use about a 20 to 30 psi on my airbrush. And then as I wanna do finer and finer work, so a lot of people struggle. You know, a lot of people get an airbrush and they're like, you know, Jim, well, they don't actually say, you know, Jim, no one actually asks me, but presuming that they would ask me, they'd say, hey, you know what, Jim, I'm trying to airbrush, but it's too much paint, and when I bring the airbrush, and I'm trying to get like little details on the model, but I can't do it because the paint spiders and it's everywhere and it goes crazy. So like, how do I actually, you know, you see these really good airbrushers paint like really fine detail, like to the point where they're doing like almost edge highlights with their airbrush, and you're like, how the hell are they doing that? Well, the way that they do it is extremely low pressure, and when I say extremely low, I'm talking between 5 to 7 psi. And in order to work with paint at 5 to 7 psi, what that does is it means that your the size of the dot at low pressure is incredibly small, and at to work in that low pressure range, you need incredibly thin paint. So you cannot put thick paint in your airbrush and then try to work at those really low pressures. So when you're doing, say, like, and I'm going to show you guys, when I'm doing some fine detail highlighting on this, like I want to just highlight like a little dot here. I don't want it to be all over. You're going to see the viscosity of my paint is going to be so thin. And also, what that allows me to do is to get really close to where I want to airbrush, and then just using a little bit of needle, a little bit of air, still get that really smooth highlight and that really smooth blend without getting paint everywhere and having this and basically just overspraying and getting things everywhere. Okay, so there's my airbrush. Put it there. I also just have like a regular pot of water here. It's kind of off camera, but that's just to clean my brush. And then I'm gonna get a very old brush here. So I have a few brushes that I like to use for my airbrush. This is actually my favorite. It's a Games Workshop medium shade brush, and you can see the tip of it is like totally gnarly. But why I like this one is because it's quite long, and so when I'm mixing paint in my cup, I can get nice and deep in there. I'm gonna keep that aside. I got my paper towel, a little bit of paper towel, which I'll just leave here so that you guys can kind of see um, what I'm doing. And then I'm gonna get my colors. For this case, I'm gonna use Deathguard Green because this is gonna be matching the existing model. And then the last two things that I highly recommend is this. So this is just a squeeze bottle with water in it. And this is really handy to have something like this. What this allows me to do, and I kind of mentioned it on the last stream, I can hydrate my wet palette. I can use it to clean out my airbrush by putting pressure. I can add water to like a drop of water to something easily. That's not going to be covered in like metallic bits and gross old paint water. I can always have a source of clean water. So that's one thing. I'm going to keep that aside. And then this here, this is my Vallejo, and I use Vallejo Airbrush Flow Improver. So not Airbrush Thinner, Airbrush Flow Improver. And this is really important because the Airbrush Thinner actually decreases your drying time. The Flow Improver actually increases your drying time. And that's really important with Airbrush because you want a really like a retardation effect, not retard, but like you want the paint to be retarded, like the drying of it to be retarded, to be slower. And so you want to use something like an Airbrush flow improver. And this is the Vallejo stuff. I swear by this stuff. And this is all I use. It's just straight flow improver, no water, no nothing. Now sometimes I will use a little bit of water, but for our purposes, I'm just going to use the flow improver. So I'm going to kind of show you guys the process. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a little bit of my flow improver. It's going to go into my... Always start with your flow improver first. You can see that there's like a little bit there, probably like, I don't know, a few drops. Like about bottom third. Hopefully you guys are finding this helpful. Know if you are. Otherwise, I will just... And then I'm going to grab my kind of Deathguard Green in here. And I'm going to kind of wipe it on the side. I'm going to do 2 big scoops because I am doing quite a bit. And then I'm going to kind of go in there and I'm going to mix it. Really nice like that. Make sure I get down. Go up the sides. Make sure that the paint is quite thick on the sides. So I'm going to kind of make sure I get right down in there. Okay. Wipe off any excess paint off my brush. And then now what I'm going to do is basically just like a bit of a backflow gargle. So what I do is for this kind of airbrush, because it has this kind of forked tip, you have to actually kind of pinch it. And then you'll notice here in the cup, you get a little bit of backflow. And that's going to help kind of push a little bit of the flow improver that was kind of stuck underneath at the bottom, and just kind of help further mix it. And then, really important, is to do a few little test sprays. So I'm first going to check my PSI, and I actually noticed that my PSI is quite low. This is the initial base coat, and this is actually quite thick. So for this, I want to actually increase my PSI. So I have a regulator on my airbrush. There's actually, my compressor, which is just down here. There's actually some airbrushes you can get with like a little regulator right here, which are super handy as well, and they let you control pressure at the airbrush, at the top of the airbrush, which is really handy. So again, I'm just going to kind of give it a little backflow, do a little test spray, and you guys can hopefully see kind of the color as it comes out. Okay, so nice and smooth. Why I'm checking this is I want to just make sure that it's nice and it's like a good. Sometimes I'll do it on my hand. Just want to make sure that it's like nice thickness or viscosity. It's not too thin, not too thick, and also that it's coming out nicely. Sometimes, especially, and I actually hate airbrushing with GW paints because I'll show you something really quick. You want to know why I hate airbrushing with GW paints? This is my Ricard's flesh. I'm gonna open it and you guys can see kind of what it looks like inside. It literally looks like, I don't know if you guys can see that. It literally looks like someone's puked inside it. There's like, it's like super chunky right out of the pot. So I generally don't like airbrushing with Games Workshop paints at all because they're just, a lot of them are just super chunky and have like dried bits of paint. My favorite, obviously, is Pro Acryl. They're super smooth. You can almost airbrush with them directly out of the bottle. But in this case, because I'm doing a classic Games Workshop scheme, I'm using the Deathguard Green. So, all right, so here we go. So I'm gonna just start by working on this piece. And again, I'm not wearing a mask right now just because I'm doing a very small amount of airbrushing, very low pressure. If I was say doing like a big tank where I was gonna be just or priming and just going like crazy, or if I'm using varnish, like I'll generally wear a mask. But when I'm doing small amounts like this, I literally like, I don't find it necessary. So it's gonna start and just check to make sure my viscosity is good on this. Hopefully you guys can see that. Okay, so I'm noticing as I'm doing this, it is a little thin, like it's coming on a little thin. So I'm actually gonna just add a touch more Death Guard green. And again, this paint thickness is something that's so important with airbrushing. It's probably the most important thing, is understanding that relationship between pressure and thickness of your paint and your mix. So sometimes you're going to want really thin paint, sometimes you're going to want really thick paint. Sometimes you're going to want really low pressure, sometimes you're going to want really high pressure. And understanding how those two relate to each other will make sure that you never end up with like jams or clogged airbrushes. Okay, let's give it a go. Okay, let's try this again. So this is kind of the first round, so I'm just going to do kind of a light spray here. You can notice I'm just doing kind of very light pattern back and forth. I don't want it to go too heavy. And you can see how far back I am right now. Because I'm just doing a base coat, I want my airbrush to be quite far back. I'm not going to be too close because again, remember, when I'm high pressure, if I go too close, the air itself will actually start to push the paint apart from where I'm painting and will cause the paint to kind of pool up in weird ways. That guy. Now normally for really small parts, I might attach them to like a base or a pin, but since these all have some place to kind of hold on to while I airbrush, I'm not too worried about that. Again, I'm going to do a few thin coats. This is the main base coat. And again, I'm not pulling this back and holding it, right? I'm just doing kind of, just like I would with a spray can, I'm doing kind of light, thin passes. Making sure I'm getting all the angles underneath. And I'll come back and I'll kind of do that a little bit better. Okay, over here, arm. Anyone else use an airbrush regularly? Anyone else have trouble with it and like maybe only use it for base coating and then kind of going with the brush? Because I'm going to do all the armor with this almost entirely with airbrush, and I'm going to show you guys how to get some really smooth close highlights just using your airbrush without having to go through and do a ton of brush work. We're still going to go do some brush work, and in fact, I'd say in most painting, a lot of people think that if you airbrush, that means like it's cheating. But even when I do a model like this, which will be heavily airbrushed, 90% of the work is still with brush. So I'm going to go do quite a bit of this base coating and kind of that initial pass. But then I'm going to go in with that brush and I'm going to really, that's what's really going to make that model look like it was painted. The airbrush is really just for base coating and basically working on things like values. Okay, so there's my 4 pieces. I got a little bit of paint on my hand. You can notice my pot's empty, so I'm going to just refill it with some paint. Add a bit more. That up. One of my biggest sins with airbrushing is I always either make too much paint or not enough paint. That's kind of my curse. I'm also going to show you guys how to clean the airbrush like super quick in between colors, but I don't have to like do this big disassembly. I'm going to do kind of a very quick kind of dirty exchange. So a little backflow. Get it all nice and okay. Now we're ready to go. We're going to go in for round 2. Getting a nice second pass, getting a nice rich color there, Death Guard green. Check it in details. The reason I would paint a model like this in sub-assemblies is A, it's going to be a lot easier to reach a lot of the details, and B, it's just a lot easier to paint, to be honest. There's always that temptation, like, as gamers, I think a lot of yeah, I can talk about that a little bit too. The problem is a lot of people like to build their models so they can start playing with them right away, and they don't care if they're painted or not. And then later you go to actually paint them, and you're like, crap, I should have not assembled that model. Basically, impossible to airbrush. Obviously, this is a commission piece, so I'm not going to be playing with it at all. so it's really easy to make that decision. But hold the line and be strong, and don't assemble it, so you can have a lot easier time airbrushing. Or just paint everything as you get it. Yeah, so with contrast, that's a really good Steve. I actually find that it's really about your shades and not your highlights. So making sure your shades are super, super deep dark is the most important part of contrast. And I'm gonna actually go through. So a lot of people are thinking, well, Jim, you're doing Death Guard green right now. That's kind of like quote unquote your dark color, your base color. So that's as dark as your shadows are gonna be. But the reality is that's actually gonna be the Death Guard green is actually gonna be my mid-tone. And I'm gonna go back with the airbrush actually, and I'm gonna actually do shading in the cracks, in the crevices with the airbrush, and you're gonna be like, well, that's crazy, because it's gonna be very small areas, but I want to make sure you guys understand how that works. So I'm basically done with the Death Guard green, and so I'm gonna show you guys my kind of technique for cleaning this really fast. So I'm just gonna grab my water here. First, what I'm gonna do is just turn it over, get rid of any excess paint, and just gonna use my fat brush to wash it out, just like this. Let's give it a little dunk, okay? Then I'm gonna take my squeezy bottle, I'm gonna shoot it in there, and then I'm gonna basically hold my trigger and backflow it like that. Dump over, give it another little swirl just to get all the paint off the sides. Give it another swirl of paint like that. Backflow it, dump it just like that. Again, just using that long old brush to kind of get in there, get any sort of paint off the sides, break it up. Okay, and then I'm gonna just clean that out. Then what I'm gonna do is just gonna take my airbrush and I'm just gonna run it in through this to run some of this cleaner through the brush. You can see I'm kind of running it through. So it's almost fully submerged, and you can see my airbrush comes out covered in soap. Then I'm just gonna take my little squeezy bottle, give it a little rinse, get that cleaner out. Okay, just like that. Put that away. Grab my little this guy. Spray out any excess water. So I've dumped out most of the water, run a little bit of water through it. And now that airbrush is good to go, ready to go for the next color, perfectly clean. Okay, so that's it. So that's now I can switch to the next color. And I will actually do that technique over an entire painting session to kind of work through my airbrush. And I won't have to pull this apart. I won't have to clean it. I'm not worried about clogs. Sometimes I won't even clean it like over 3 or 4 days, as long as I flush it out. And what I'll usually do is just leave a little bit of water in it, just to kind of keep everything nice and wet, so that it doesn't kind of like dry. If there is any paint in there, I'll kind of keep a little water in there, just to kind of keep it empty. But that's it. So a lot of people have these nightmares of like, oh my god, the airbrush, it's such a nightmare to clean. But that's literally like all the cleaning I'll do. And then maybe once a week, I'll actually disassemble it, or after a long hiatus or a very long gross painting session where there's like I've dumped paint all over myself, I'll kind of go in and I'll kind of break it down. So, let's see. How are we doing? Hope you guys are finding this helpful. I feel like all my trade secrets. So.